Welcome back to the Jackson Neill Music Podcast here on Sunday, February 3rd, 2019. Thank you so much for tuning in on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, Spotify, all those great places you can find this podcast and my other ones. Today I want to talk a little bit about the Super Bowl and the halftime performance. I'm recording this on Sunday, same day it's getting released. Super Bowl is tonight. Maroon 5, Travis Scott, Big Boy, they are the performers. I want to touch on what it means to be a halftime performer at the Super Bowl, and does it really mean as much as it used to? But before we jump into that, I want to mention that the Jackson Neill Music Podcast is brought to you by Believe the Hype. This new sneaker selling company buys the latest hard-to-get pairs and sells them straight back to you. That way, you can rock the latest pair of Jordans or Yeezys even if you miss out on their release day. Visit their Twitter and Instagram at Believe Hype Shop and check out their eBay store to see their current stock. Links to all of that down in the description. So, looking at this year's Super Bowl and who the performers are, it becomes obvious that, you need to only big names invited. People like Maroon 5, obviously a huge band. As of the past decade, I would say, or even plus. Travis Scott, an artist who was a little surprised to see him join the lineup, but still very, very big otherwise. And Big Boy, a name that many people might not recognize at first until you realize that he is, along with Andre 3000, makes Outkast. So, definitely big names, considering that it's in Atlanta. Having the presence of Big Boy from Outkast is huge there. But this Super Bowl has just kind of felt different. If I think personally going into this game that it's going to end up being a ratings nightmare for what the Super Bowl usually is. I don't think this Super Bowl is going to be as widely watched as it usually is, even though it has gigantic teams like LA and Boston. I think the LA will help because that whole Los Angeles area is just so many people. But this Super Bowl is not feeling that big. I'm a big sports person as well, and the NBA has been huge all this week coming up to it. The Super Bowl hasn't really been that big of a discussion point. And looking at the halftime performances, this year with Maroon 5, Travis Scott, and Big Boy actually feels like a better year than we've seen in a little bit of time. And here's why, is that with the Super Bowl, the thing you always have to keep in mind is that you have to appeal to as many audiences, the biggest audience possible. That there are so many different people that watch the Super Bowl from all ages, all age groups, everywhere all over the country, the world even, is that you have to kind of pick a performer that is middle of the road enough. And usually that's not too difficult. I mean, there has been, some blips here and there. Last year, there's always qualms about certain performances. Last year, people didn't love Justin Timberlake. There's been obviously big things that happened in the past that led to then, older bands coming in there, people criticizing that. So the Super Bowl halftime will always be under so much scrutiny, will always be criticized because of just how big of an event it is. And they call it the biggest concert in the world, so you have to have a headlining performer there who's kind of, in the middle of everything. But the thing that I want to focus on is the Super Bowl halftime as important as we really make it out to be? Because the Super Bowl halftime is an audience in front of millions and millions of people, and it should be representative of what those millions and millions of people, listen to and want to see on that stage, that big of a stage. And while I think Travis Scott is an excellent representation of what's going on, you can't help but wonder the question of Maroon 5 in there. While they are an insanely popular band, they did have a recent song with Cardi B that kind of blew up. It does feel though that it's a couple years after the timing of when they were their biggest. But in terms of the Super Bowl halftime, in terms of how much of a grab it is, I look at this simple fact that right now there are, hip-hop is the biggest genre in the world. Statistically speaking, it is the biggest genre there is. And when I see people like Cardi B, who is quickly becoming one of the biggest names in hip-hop and pop music in general because of that, and other rappers turn down the opportunity to perform at the Super Bowl, that makes me question, if the Super Bowl halftime claims to be the biggest concert in the world, claims to be the biggest show there is, claims to be the who's who, then how come they can't get the biggest stars from the biggest genre of music? Because if I'm deciding what the biggest show, what the biggest concert is, what the biggest whatever is, you got to take the biggest stars from the biggest section of it. And what people seem to underestimate a lot of times is just how popular hip-hop is really, in some ways, the runaway numbers that it has in terms of a genre. Because in the very mainstream things, like mainstream performances, I think of stuff like, things like the Super Bowl halftime, it doesn't get as much recognition because of, the profane nature of the genre, that it does not make for great live TV viewing. And one stat that I, was kind of looking up around New Year's, when I was looking at the lineups of who are the biggest, who are performing at the, New Year's celebrations and all of that, and it just felt considerably light on rappers. I kind of realized if you're a television executive person, you don't, you love someone like the Imagine Dragons, where that's not real, or there's no lyrics of theirs that is going to rub anybody the wrong way. But the one stat that I kind of looked up was between two artists right now who are both have pretty sizable audiences in their respective kind of sectors. One of them, Shawn Mendes, don't really have to explain who he is, very, very popular. Another one is the rapper Logic, who he's relevant in mainstream hip hop, but his fan base has always leaned to be more kind of a fan favorite. You're a Logic fan, maybe, but you might not even be a more of a mainstream hip hop fan. He's a very selective fan base, I guess you could call it. And if you were to just pay attention to award shows, performances on national TV, things along that line, people who get the public discourse, all that kind of stuff, you would think Shawn Mendes is way, way larger than Logic and would blow him out of the water in record sales. And, I thought that just, look, it's Shawn Mendes seems like on every single talk show, every single performance. And then you realize that both Shawn Mendes and Logic released albums in 2018. Actually, Logic released 2. His second one, Young Sinatra 4, sold about, I think it was like around 167,000 copies its first week, which is a pretty good number. Shawn Mendes sold about 185. And bigger number, yes, but I think that would catch most people by surprise. Because most people would think that including myself, would think that someone like Shawn Mendes would be runaway past Logic in terms of sales. But yet, it's a lot closer than people think. When you look at people who are dominating album sales, who are dominating the charts nowadays, it is all hip-hop. So that's why when I'm looking at the Super Bowl halftime, and I'm saying it's in, right now, a city that is probably the biggest city in hip-hop right now. Look at I can't even list all of the artists to come out of Atlanta in the past 5 years, let alone 15, 20, that are so influential. And the fact that they could only get Big Boy out of all of that, or they would only go for Big Boy out of all of those, huge hip-hop artists from Atlanta, that to me just shows whether they all turned it down, because only certain people's offers that they turned it down went public. The fact that they wouldn't even go for them, or they would just turn it down. This whole claim to be the biggest show there is, the biggest concert there is, it just doesn't seem as founded. And there's just this perception that you don't, once you get on Super Bowl halftime, you've really, really made it. And you certainly see the star power on that platform every single year. But I think as hip-hop is now the biggest genre, as it keeps on having large and large numbers and proving that it is the most popular music genre in all of the world, I think the main thing we have to decide is, do we have to switch up a little bit judging what is success in music? Because rappers will dominate the charts. Rappers that you won't expect. Someone like Logic, who, I'm even a fan of Logic, and I didn't think Young Sinatra 4 was all that big of a deal in 2018, and yet it got 167,000 first week, whereas someone like Shawn Mendes pulls 185. I thought when Shawn Mendes dropped its project, it was a much, much larger deal. And, and we judge off of music of, how many talk shows are you on, how many times do you see them, performing like a New Year's Eve or a Grammys or this or that, or a Super Bowl halftime. And the fact of the matter is that bands like Maroon 5 and Imagine Dragons are getting pegged for these large sporting events in front of these masses of people, because their music kind of fits that. You're never going to get offended, or you're never going to get, no one's going to listen to a Maroon 5 song and disagree with those contents of that song, if that makes any sense. Same thing with an Imagine Dragons song. And while I don't blame the Super Bowl or the college football playoff or anybody else or any other television executives for not putting more of a hip-hop presence in their programming, because of the obvious nature of how profane a lot of these, top rap songs are, I just think that people have to realize that more, and we have to start to remeasure and recalculate and readjust and rethink what success means for artists nowadays. And a big part of that is the Super Bowl halftime. Is it as big of a deal as we really make it out to be? An artist gets picked to perform there. Is it really that big of a deal? I mean, you look outside of hip-hop. Rihanna and Pink, they turned it down too. People are turning down the Super Bowl halftime. And now this is a large part to Colin Kaepernick and his social stance, so I do understand that. But you would think the way that we talk about the Super Bowl halftime, the way that it's just considered throughout the music industry, throughout society, is the fact that it's too big of an offer to turn down. Even Travis Scott, someone who took the offer, made sure that the NFL was going to contribute on some charitable work. So, and he's not even the headliner, and he was able to make sure the NFL would do that. So, I really am interested to, first of all, see kind of the ratings, to see kind of how this all works with Maroon 5, Travis Scott and Big Boy. It just feels like such a crazy combination of artists right there. I have no idea how they're going to make this work, but I'm interested to see if it turns out pretty well. I mean, it might. Don't take this message as me trashing people like Shawn Mendes or Imagine Dragons or Maroon 5. I mean, I've always loved Maroon 5. I think it's kind of hard to find somebody who despises them. I think I still listen to songs about Jane pretty regularly, some hits off of that. I'll hear Imagine Dragons on the radio. I've listened to Shawn Mendes' latest album a ton of times in 2018. But it's just that surprising nature of sometimes we underestimate really the immense appeal of hip-hop commercially, because it is unable to translate well into the live audience of TV. With that'll wrap it up for this edition of the Jackson Neill Music Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, you can catch this on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, Spotify, so many platforms it's hard to keep count. Also in the same podcast feeds are the Jackson Neill Sports and the Anything Goes with Jackson Neill Music Podcast. Anything Goes with Jackson Neill Podcast, excuse me. On Anything Goes, I interview musicians, and on the Sports one, I discuss sports and talk with sports writers. So make sure to check those out. Anything Goes have some really cool interviews coming up. The sports one usually publishes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and this music one on Sundays. So keep an eye out on those feeds. Also, remember, the Jackson Neill Music Podcast is brought to you by Believe the Hype. This new sneaker selling company buys the latest hard-to-get pairs and sells them straight back to you. That way you can rock the latest pair of Jordans or Yeezys, even if you miss out on their release day. Visit their Twitter and Instagram at Believe Hype Shop and check out their eBay store to see their current stock. Links to all of that down in the description. Also down in the description are links to my Twitter and Instagram at Jackson Neill 20, where you can catch links to all my podcasts, additional content, and all of that great stuff. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you all next time.